Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we will talk about the last days of Mughal Empire. Bahadur Shah Zafar was the last Mughal emperor and the direct descendant of Genghis Khan and Timur and of Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan. In his lifetime, he had seen his own dynasty reduced to humiliating insignificance as the British transformed into superpower. He came to the throne in his mid-60s when it was impossible to reverse the political decline of the Mughals. The British progressively took over more and more of the Mughals' power, removing his name from the coins and seizing control even in the city of Delhi, and finally removing him from Redfort. He was dragged into an unorganized uprising, the First War of Independence of 1857 in India. During the revolt, the British killed every soul in Delhi. Delhi was left an empty ruin. Though the Mughals had surrendered peacefully, most of his sons were captured and killed. The emperor was put on a trial and sentenced to transportation. He left his beloved Delhi in a bullock cart to Rangoon in the present-day Myanmar. Separated from everything he loved, the great emperor of Mughals died in exile a few years later. For this video, I have referred the book The Last Mughal, The Fall of a Dynasty, Delhi, 1857 by William Dalrymple. Although Bahadur Shah Zafar was the last Mughal and the central figure of this book, it is not his biography. It narrates the last days of Mughals and its final destruction in 1857. Also, this book throws light on the many reasons that made the rebellion a failure. The man who began the erosion of Mughal status was Charles Metcalfe, the British resident in Delhi since 1826. The British decided to sink Bahadur Shah Zafar into insignificance, letting the public know that the British was no more inferior to the Mughals. Henceforth, more and more of the Mughals' rights and privileges were stripped away by 1852. Zafar was left with nothing but his palace and lingering reputation of his dynasty. The King Zafar was not given the right to choose his own successor. Instead, the British imposed the right of succession to the firstborn child. When Zafar's oldest living son died in 1849, the British assumed his next son, Mirza Fakru, should become the successor. But Zafar nominated his son Mirza Jawan Bakt, a boy of 8 years old, 15th of Zafar's many sons, and the only son of his favorite wife, Zinat Mahal. Zafar fathered in all no fewer than 16 sons and 31 daughters. His last son, Musa Shah Abbas, was conceived as late as 1845 when the emperor was fully 70 years old. The life of the senior princes was extremely comfortable, and Zafar's own children had a fair degree of freedom to live their own lives. Besides the senior princes, there were over 2,000 poor princes and princesses, the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren of previous monarchs, most of whom lived a life of poverty in their own walled quarters of the palace to the southwest of the area occupied by Zafar and his immediate family. Running the domestic arrangements of Redfort was clearly not one of the Zafar's talents, at least in his old age. There were instances when the poor princes broke the silence and made a mass petition addressed to the British resident, claiming that their basic rights were being abused. In January 1852, Mirza Fakru met the British resident and lieutenant governor and signed a secret understanding document. In return, British demanded when Mirza Fakru became an emperor, he would move from Redfort and hand over the old fort of Shah Jahan to the British. Also, he should drop the Mughals' claim of superior status to the British. Very soon, Zafar came to know about the agreement. He reacted with fury. Mirza Fakru was expelled from the court, and those who professed a friendship with him was declared as the enemy to the state. However, nothing changed from the British position. Zafar was sunk into unimportant gloom. He decided to abdicate the throne and go for Hajj, and spent the rest of his life there in Mecca. However, after a few months, Zafar changed his mind and decided to make arrangements for the marriage of his favorite son, Jawan Bakt. An exceptionally lavish wedding was planned to raise the profile of the prince. Zafar seemed to have believed that the British might change their mind after a magnificent wedding. It was his last-ditch attempt to persuade the British resident, though in vain. By 1852, the British and the Mughals found themselves in an uneasy equilibrium. The balance was, however, broken dramatically in 1853 by a series of deaths. The British officials who had signed the agreement with Mirza Fakru were all dead, suspiciously. The most suspicious was the slow and lingering death of the resident Sir Thomas Metcalfe by poisoning. Before he died, Sir Thomas had predicted that Mirza Fakru would not long outlive him, but surprisingly he did not. He died of cholera and not of poisoning. To the new resident, Simon Fraser, Zafar insisted for the succession of his favorite son again. However, the new resident had a different idea. He strongly urged the Governor-General, Lord Canning, that none of the princes should be considered. He was thinking of the annexation of Mughals empire after the king's death as per the doctrine of lapse policy introduced by Lord Dalhousie. In Delhi, the first sign of growing unrest showed after the death of Mirza Fakru. Early in the morning of 18th March 1857, a flyer on a dirty piece of paper appeared on the back wall of Juma Masjid in Delhi. A naked sword and a shield was depicted on it. The following day, the contents of the note was very printed in full in the newspaper Sirajul Akhbar, creating a ripple of excitement further. Already there had been brief reports in the Urdu newspapers about the mysterious Chapati movement, the passing of mysterious chapatis from village to village across India. But they did not seem to have got any closer to Delhi, and the significance of the Chapati movement was unknown. The most prominent of all were the reports which began to appear about the unrest in the army of Bengal. The growing unrest started in Delhi at least by February 1857, immediately after British had unilaterally annexed the Kingdom of Oudh. British had already annexed many small kingdoms as per the policy of Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, known as Doctrine of Lapse. It banned the practice of adopting sons and succeeding them to their father's throne. Satara, Jhansi, Sambalpur, Udaipur and Nagpur were some of the states which were annexed by the British East India Company. In Punjab, the son-in-law of Thomas Metcalfe, Edward Campbell, was in charge of training troops. The new field guns arrived had crude barrels to have more accuracy and range, but the guns were very difficult to load. In order to get the metal ball down the barrel, a quantity of grease was required. What Edward had to teach his troops was to bite off the tip of the greased cartridges and pour the powder and the ball into the rifle barrel. The first batch of cartridges had coated with too much grease. Rumors spread that the grease was made from a mixture of cow and pig fat and was found offensive by both Hindus and Muslims. The rumors were seemed to have based on truth, as Lord Canning later admitted it. The ingredients of the grease quickly changed to beeswax, ghee, and butter. Sepoys, the Indian soldiers employed within European military garrisons, believed that it was not an accidental mistake that the company used defiling ingredients in the beginning. They believed that it was a conspiracy to break the sepoys' caste and ritual purity before embarking on a project of mass conversion to Christianity. The sepoys were already on the verge of mutiny over the issues of pay and regulations. Even after years of gallant and faithful service, no Indian could rise above the level of Subadar. The real authority remained entirely with the British. As the time passed, the signs of disaffections were becoming more and more apparent. On 29th March at Barakpur in West Bengal, one sepoy named Mangal Pandey shot and wounded two British officers. He was promptly tried and hanged. Soon afterwards, Ambala cantonments in Haryana were hit by 5 bombs over the use of greased cartridges. More worse was any sepoy who bit the cartridge was outcast by his fellows and tainted as Christians. By the end of April, the trouble had spread to Meerut, where 3rd Light Infantry refused to fire the cartridges. The 85 members of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry in Meerut were tried by court-martial, convicted and sentenced up to 10 years of hard labor. Those 85 men were broken out of the prison by their comrades and headed to Delhi. They ransacked the nearby military stations and killed any Europeans they could find. 1857, May 11, morning 7 a.m. King Zafar noticed that a tall pillar of smoke billowing out of the toll house. He sent messengers to inquire about it. It was Indian cavalrymen in company uniforms looted and burned the toll house. They had killed the tollkeeper and the manager of the city telegraph office. The mob killed all those British officials who happened to meet them. On hearing this, the king gave immediate orders that the gate of the city and the fort should all be closed. Sir Theophilus Metcalfe, son of Thomas Metcalfe, was a junior magistrate in company service during that time. He was on his first day of his 6-month-long vacation. It was his first proper break in India after 7 years of service. He went to his office at Kachori Courthouse to hand over the charges to his successor. His office was inside Kashmiri Gate, the northern gate to the city of Delhi, built by Shah Jahan. He found the court empty with only his assistant magistrate present, who was waiting, not knowing what to do. Theophilus looked out through the riverfront window at the back of his office. On the far bank, he found a large body of infantry led by Indian cavalrymen. Theophilus went quickly to meet his friend, Lieutenant George Willoughby of Bengal Artillery, who was in charge of arsenal. Theophilus asked him for 2 guns to place at the end of Yamuna Bridge to prevent the mutineers from crossing it. But they were late, and the mutineers had already taken possession of the Delhi bank of Yamuna. Theophilus set off quickly to close the Calcutta gate, which commanded the passage from the bridge into the city. Theophilus and his senior colleagues, along with the resident Simon Fraser, managed to close it in time. Sepoys failed to open the gate, and they went towards the south along the sandy bed of the river to find an alternate route to enter into the city. Guessing that the Sepoys might enter the city either through Rajghat or Sinathol Masjid gate of the city, Simon Fraser asked Theophilus to head to the south of the palace. Theophilus went quickly. After a few thousand yards, he saw the mob entering the city through the Lahore gate, the main gate of the palace. The mob was hunting down any Christian they could find. Theophilus removed his coat and trousers so that he wouldn't stand out from the rest of the crowd. By then, the whole city was in a state of uproar. Many shops were looted and smoke was rising from the European mansions. Very soon, a counter-attack was planned by the British. The Indian troops stationed in the Delhi cantonments had then reached the Kashmiri Gate for a counter-attack. Theophilus went to the Kashmiri Gate thinking that the troops would save him. As he galloped past a mosque, a large brick thrown from an upper window hit him. He fell from the horse and rolled off into a ditch, still and silent. Simon Fraser and his colleagues were trapped in the Calcutta Gate at that time. Somehow Fraser managed to escape with his buggy and arrived safely at the Lahore Gate. He ordered the guards to close the gate, but no attention was paid to his order. By this time, a large crowd had collected. Fraser had a feeling of hostility, and he went to the quarters of Captain Douglas. But in a sudden attack, he died at the stairs of the quarters. Many Christians in the city got killed. The religious nature of the uprising was immediately apparent. British men and women converted into Islam were spared, and all the Indians converted into Christianity were killed. The most enthusiastic insurgents who had joined the Sepoys were the workers of lower middle class, but the elite club, both Hindus and Muslims, remained dubious. Many people in Delhi were looted simply because they were rich, with an excuse that they were sheltering Christians. The Redfort was also no less chaotic. It was untenanted and deserted. The King Zafar had no force to obey his orders. As the day progressed, an increasing number of ragged sepoys from Meerut rode and walked into the fort. Many gathered around King's private apartments. They had expected a warm welcome from the king. However, the king was not even ready to see them. Later in the evening, the leaders sent word to the king that they had come to fight for their religious belief and to pay respect to their majesty. But the king refused to see them again. The crowd became furious, and they began to fire with their muskets, pistols, and carbines, making a great clamor. Hearing the noise, the king came out. The king argued with the troops for a while. He was like a chessboard king after the checkmate. The king told the crowd that he had no treasure, magazine, or troops to support them in some way. but the mob claimed only his blessings. With armed, threatening, and excited men surrounding him on all sides, the king had little choice. He gave them his blessings. The king Zafar made a critical choice that changed the fate of his dynasty and the city of Delhi. King Zafar could see the arrival of mutineers as an opportunity he never dreamt of to re-establish his great Mughal dynasty. He sanctioned a firing of 21-gun salute to mark the beginning of the new phase in his reign. Though Zafar showed an increased openness to the uprising, he was never entirely wholehearted and was always ambivalent. But that never seemed to change the whole nature of the rebellion. Next day morning, 12th May, Delhi was almost completely emptied of British, who had dominated Delhi since they defeated the Marathas in 1803. In Delhi, several of the elite leading aristocrats were manhandled and their premises were ransacked. Most of them were accused of sheltering the Europeans. Merchants, jewelers, money launderers, and celebrated sweet makers all were looted and their houses were plundered. In the meantime, some of the Sipahis simply took the opportunity to enrich themselves. The king was unable to stop the plundering and the violence in his city to bring the city back to normal. His position was so weak that he was not even able to stop the Sipahis from turning his hall of public audience into an ammunition store and dormitory for artillery. Every day, 300 to 400 men joined to make the count of the rebels near 10,000 in Delhi. Delhi became a city of darkness with an incapable ruler. The ordinary people of Delhi became tired of the uncertainties around them. In the palace, Delhi Darbar was resumed after a long time. But behind the scene, the royal family reacted by splitting into competing and deeply divided groups. The group that most enthusiastically embraced the uprising was a party of 5 passed-over princes. 4 of them were of little talent, but only appeared in the palace records earlier. The 5th prince, Mirza Mughal, was however very talented and was established himself as an effective head of civil administration. He was the oldest surviving legitimate male child of the king. In 1857, he was 29, 9 years younger than his powerful stepmother, Zeenat Mahal. 12th May morning, all the 5 princes came to Darbar and applied for the principal commands in the army. But the king rejected their request as per the advice of Zeenat Mahal, his favorite wife. However, the Sipahis nominated Mirza Mughal as the commander-in-chief after a few days. Mirza Mughal put an incessant stream of orders and commands, attempting to get the Sipahis out of the city, into the military camps and to stop plundering. He promised the Sipahis regular pay and raised money to provide it. He sent circulars in king's name to all the princes and rajas of India, asking them to join the uprising. When most of the princes threw their lot with the uprising, having little to lose and much to gain, Zeenat Mahal and her son Jawan Bakht took the opposite course. It was the first time since their marriage the king had publicly gone against his favorite wife, Zeenat Mahal. Zeenat Mahal calculated that the British would ultimately win, and showing loyalty to them might result in recognizing the succession of her son, Jawan Bakht. So he kept her son at a distance from the insurgents and did not involve him in any administration of the city. The king's prime minister, Hakim Ahsanullah Khan, was also ranged alongside Zeenat Mahal and her son. On 16th May, the Sipahis presented a letter bearing the seals of Prime Minister Ahsanullah Khan and Chief Eunuch and advisor of Zeenat Mahal, Nawab Mahbub Ali Khan. Sipahis had complained that the Prime Minister and Nawab had sent that letter to English, inviting them to come to the city immediately. In the letter, it was also mentioned that if the British agreed to acknowledge Mirza Jawan Bakht as the successor, they would on their part engage to seize and make over all the soldiery in Delhi. But the Prime Minister and eunuch saw that it was a forged document. But the men of cavalry and infantry drew their swords and surrounded them. The Sipahis firmly believed that they had a sacred understanding with the British. It was at that point that one of the Sipahis mentioned about the British prisoners that Zafar had kept in safe custody in the palace. The Sipahis accused that the Prime Minister and eunuch were keeping them alive. The Sipahis called for the prisoners and took them to a peepal tree near the palace drum house where musicians used to play for Mughals. Sepoys began to taunt them that they were about to be slaughtered. The king stood like a dumb puppet. The massacre was a turning point for Zafar. His failure to prevent it proved very fatal for him and his dynasty later. Even by the end of second week of May, nobody could control the rebels. The mutineers from the city and from the rest of India, everybody was busy looting and plundering. Behind the anarchy, there existed a fundamental problem of authority. Each regiment had mutinied individually and came to Delhi by its own. They remained self-contained and camped separately and accepted no overall sepoy general. They strongly resisted a commander of any other regiment having authority over them. Mirza Mughal's attempts to act as a coordinating commander-in-chief had only very limited success. Fight between infantry regiments and cavalrymen became more common. Delhi and Meerut sepoys remained on bad terms and always had fight over the division of loot from the city. Mughals were never able to pay them or properly command them. On 23rd May, General Anson set off from Ambala in Haryana with his troops to Delhi under the command of General Barnard. On 27th May, General Wilson left Meerut in belated pursuit of the mutineers. His small force numbered only 2,000 infantry, 50 cavalry and 6 guns. Its destination was Alipur, 8 miles north of Delhi, where it was supposed to underway with the main field force from Ambala. On 25th May, a large force of Sepoys under Mirza Abu Bakr, king's oldest surviving legitimate grandson, set off from Delhi in a bid to take Meerut. Neither side had any idea that an army belonging to the other side was heading in its direction. The two rival forces finally met, to the great surprise of the both, at the new British-built steel suspension bridge over the Hinton River in the afternoon of 30th May. After a short fight, General Wilson's army had won an important and symbolic victory over the Sepoys. However, the artillery of the Sepoys had been much more effective than anticipated, and the British casualties had been severe. Moreover, there was no sign of General Barnard's Delhi field force, and the horse artillery of Wilson, which had been the key to the British victory, was virtually out of ammunition. On June 1st, Wilson considered retreating back to Meerut, but the following day he was unexpectedly reinforced by the Sirmur regiment of Gurkhas under General Reid and a party of sappers who had marched down from Dehradun. All were looking for General Barnard's Delhi field force. Meanwhile, Barnard's field force was making a slow progress to the rendezvous with Wilson. One of the reasons was the number of Indians it casually slaughtered as it passed down the Grand Trunk Road. On Trinity Sunday, 7th June, General Wilson finally led his forces into General Barnard's newly pitched camp at Alipur, 8 miles north of Delhi. Mirza Mughal had not wasted the time between the defeat at Hindan Bridge and the arrival of Delhi field force at Alipur. His men erected batteries of artillery on several bastions on the city walls and also outside the city along the ridge, the rocky spine of Aravallis. A strong defensive position was also established on the Grand Trunk Road, blocking the access to Delhi from the north. It was an ideal stand with marshland on either side. Any force coming from the direction of Alipur would have no option but to charge down straight into the face of the massed Mughal guns. A large infantry force commanded by Mirza Kisa Sultan, assisted by the chief eunuch Mahbub Ali Khan, was sent up at 6 p.m. on 7th June and placed between and behind the batteries awaiting the British. Next day, early morning by around 4:30 a.m., the British force came face to face with the Indian troops. After a continuous fight, by 8 o'clock in the morning, it was all over. British had a strategic victory over the Indian troops. Sepoys who survived hurried towards the city, pouring through the Kashmir, Lahore and Kabul gates, leaving the gates open behind them. Seeing their fellow rebels near the bridge fleeing as fast as they could, the rebels who were posted on the ridge left their post and abandoned the cannons, tents and all their ammunitions and fled into the city. British advanced further and later divided themselves into two columns. Mirza Mughal's newly erected batteries were taken with little resistance. When the English army reached the cantonment, they saw that all the entrenchments on the ridge were completely quiet. So they went up and occupied those posts, burned the rebel camps, and turned the abandoned cannons towards the city. By the evening, entire ridge was on the British hands. The British decided to halt at the ridge without entering the city. The British at this stage had relatively few cannons and no large siege guns. However, the British were also counterattacked, targeting the city and the palace with their limited artillery. In 2 weeks after the British returned to the ridge, the rebel forces received several thousand reinforcements from Ambala and Jalandhar in the north and Haryana and Nazirabad in the west. Around 3,000 Jat peasant farmers were also joined against the British. Already alarmed by the number of violent, unpaid and hungry sepoys within the city walls, the people of Delhi were doubtful about the pleasure of hosting additional thousands. The sepoys' attack on the raids failed repeatedly owing to the lack of strategy. Uncoordinated attacks and single regiment after single regiment could do a little more than annoying the British. Each night, the rebels returned to sleep in the city after the attack. That made things worse. Each morning, the ground gained the day before had to be regained. Unlike the rebels, the British had a fairly regular supply of food coming from Grand Trunk Road from Ambala. But the troops had no shelter or shade except the tents. Many died of apoplexy and sunstroke. As the July and rain progressed, many of their men died of cholera. British had no choice but to choose a defensive strategy to preserve their positions until reinforcements arrived from Punjab. There were around 4,000 men in European side against 20,000 and more men below. Very soon, enormous number of rebels were also joined from Bareilly Brigade under the command of General Bakht Khan. The British were looking helplessly through their binoculars. On the British side, a small force from Firozpur and Punjab marched into the camp. The King Zafar believed that he could trust Bakht Khan and he gave him supreme military authority over all the rebel armies, replacing Mirza Mughal. In return, Bakht Khan made an energetic attempt to solve the many problems that had paralyzed the rebels, despite their overwhelming numerical superiority to the small British-led force. He also tried to sort out looting and plundering in the city. Also, he made arrangements for paying salaries. On 9th July, after his arrival in Delhi, Bakht Khan set for a concerted attempt to finish the British positions on the ridge. His troops managed to get into the British camp in white uniforms in disguise. The full force of Bareilly army poured out of the city. The British managed to drive them back. But rather than fleeing, sepoys lured the British away from their establishments and continued to fight farther down the slopes, where the British had less cover. Out of the small British force encased, many men died. Elsewhere, a little to the west, Bakht Khan, supported by Zafar This, led an attack that captured the outlying British picket at the gardens of Tiskazari. The 9th July attack was most successful. However, the expectation of the city and the palace had been high, and the people believed that there was no breakthrough, as the British remained on the ridge. But no one in the city realized that how successful Bakht Khan's tactics were. They could see only the lines remain unchanged. Muttering against Bakht Khan soon set in, and his grip on the sepoys began to slip. The sepoys began to raise complaint against him, and the king lost confidence on him. At the end of July, the supreme authority was taken from Khan and authority was given to the Court of Administration under the presidency of Mirza Mughal. The court never acted as a unified central command, and Khan always kept a distance from it. The court achieved the direct opposite of what it was intended for. Rather than coordinating the different rebel regiments, it emphasized the existing divisions between them, polarizing more dramatically than before. The end of Bakht Khan's military system brought an instant relief for the British on the ridge. Another blow happened soon when the rebels divided themselves on communal grounds between Hindus and Muslims, dividing the city at its central religious axis. The British were aware of these communal tensions through their spies and were expecting a riot. The king did his best to reduce the tension. He became more depressed and detached himself from the uprising. By the end of July, the military balance was swinging irreversibly in favor of the British. The rebels' attacks on the ridge became more infrequent. Every time a new regiment of mutinous sepoys marched into Delhi, the troops were made to prove themselves by attacking the ridge before they were accepted as part of the rebel army. On 14th August, the Punjab troops under the command of Brigadier General John Nicholson marched into the Delhi Ridge. The size of the British army almost doubled. General Nicholson was an imperial psychopath with utmost brutality. The British became more and more confident day by day. There was more food, more luxury around. The British had enough time for recreations like fishing, playing football and cricket, even pony race. However, there were many deaths due to cholera, and the string of decaying bodies and animals on the ridge worsened than ever. The news of violent and vicious assault of the British in response to the uprising in the other cities of India was filtering through to Delhi from those sepoys who had survived the carnage of British Army's retribution at Kanpur. Every village in the path of the army was torched and burned. To ritually outcast the men, pork, beef, and everything that could possibly break the caste stuffed down in their throats. Also, all the Hindus were buried and Mohammedans were burnt. One of the British captains wrote in his letter, "I cannot consider these sepoys as human beings, and it is only a common practice to destroy them as reptiles." Too cruel the British were. Remember, they came for trade and what they were doing to India. The limitation and failure of military strategy of the sepoys became apparent for many months. They failed to gather intelligence, to coordinate effectively with other rebel centers such as Kanpur and Lucknow, or to persuade most of the independent Rajas of central India and Rajaputras to come off the fence and join with the cause. In particular, the Delhi rebels failed to recognize the possibilities of attacking British from the rear end of the ridge. As July gave way to August, the city of Delhi grew hungrier and thirstier. The British had cut off the flow of Yamuna Canal into the city early in June. Hence, for water, the city mainly had to depend on brackish walls within the city and the river to the east, where the water carriers found themselves exposed to the British shell fire. Throughout July and August, the Court of Administration led by Mirza Mughal made frantic effort to raise money to pay for food and to cover the expenses of the rebels. At first, he could borrow some money, but later the moneylenders refused to pay him. Many of them were thrown into jail until they paid up. It was not just money which was running out. By the middle of August, supplies of gunpowder and gun caps were also running low. The production of gunpowder was also stopped due to the lack of saltpeter and sulfur. Making the situation worse, a British shell ignited one of the principal gunpowder factories. By mid of August, a large number of rebels began to drift away from the city. Any remaining hope of victory over the British was diminishing further by the fierce disagreements between the regiments, which was worse than ever. The leaders of the brigade from Nimak took against Bakht Khan's authority even more strongly than the subardars of Meerut and Delhi regiments. They accused him for sending notes to the British on the raids based on a false evidence given by a Sikh witness. Bakht Khan saw his loyalty, but Zafar openly discussed the possibility of banning him from the court. While the officers of the Nimak brigade began hatching a plot to disarm the Bareilly troops by force. In the view to re-establish the authority, Khan presented an ingenious plan to attack the British. The king agreed to him. The plan was to march towards Ajmer gates, making the British feel that the sepoys were leaving the city towards Jaipur. Then make a surprise move to cross the Yamuna Bridge Canal and then double back to ambush the British from behind. It was the best plan if it was executed 2 months before, when the British forces were less in men and artillery. It was heavily raining when the sepoys reached the Yamuna Canal. They found that the bridge was already destroyed by the British. It took more than 24 hours to mend the bridge, and during the wait, the entire force was exposed to the bad weather. Moreover, the troops were starving for 3 days. After crossing the bridge, the troops had to wade through the swamp. The water was above their knees and they progressed very slowly. When they set off from Delhi, Baghdur Khan's Bareilly troops had been in the lead. But after the halt at the bridge, it was Nimag Brigade led by Baghdur Khan's rivals and enemies. The British were watching everything through their field glasses, and they had already sent half of the troops for defense well before. After many hours of work, the British troops arrived almost near Nimag Force. Bareilly forces were far away from them at that time. The British opened a surprise fire. The grape from the British guns poured into Nimag troops. The sepoys could neither advance nor retreat, and their numbers began to fall. When Baghdur Khan heard the gunfire, he did not act to support the Nimag troops. Instead, he stopped to progress further. It was evident that one party decided the ruin of the other. Each leader wanted his own name alone to be famous. The Nimag troops fled in utter disorder, and the British continued to fire. Their guns fell into the hands of the British. General Khan returned to the palace in disgrace and was abused at the Darbar for having left the Nimag troops to be defeated. A week later, an 8-mile-long convoy of troops, guns, and ammunition arrived at the British camp. The siege guns were so enormous that it took a team of elephants to pull them. On September 8, the British began pounding the city walls. By September 12, all the British guns were firing round after round as fast as they could, 24 hours a day. What British did not know was that on the other side of the walls, Mirza Mughal had begun to construct an elaborate system of barricades and street defenses. His cannons and snipers were getting ready, awaiting for the British to come. When the British took the ground between the ridge and the city walls, they became easy targets, and rebel forces struck back with force. The British coordinated their heavy gunfire so that the shots struck the wall in great salvos. Soon the city walls crumpled and made multiple large breaches. Despite of the hunger, the rebels fought with a vigor that they had never shown before. By Sunday, 13th of September, the assault was imminent once the British entered the city. Both the parties were expecting a face-to-face attack to take place the following day morning. Many British men were busy writing their wills and last letters. Within the city, preparations for assault was almost complete. Meanwhile, Sinat Mahal was in her last-minute negotiations with the British. The British divided their troops in 5 columns, including a reserve. Early morning, 4 columns marched down in silence from the ridge. The assault on the city started as exactly as planned. The British met with a hailstorm of bullets. The British destroyed the city gates and charged into the city from different gates. By noon, the British spirits were sinking fast with the realization of the scale of forces ranged against them and the strength of the rebels' determination to resist them. The British had control over a quarter of the city, but that costed them heavy loss. On 14th, Mirza Mughal had sent an urgent message to Zafar and begged him to provide additional funds to pay the troops so that they could eat and fight properly. Zafar's reply was like this: "Send the horse harness and silver howdahs and chows to Mirza Mughal. He may sell them and pay all with the earnings. I have nothing else left." Throughout 15 and 16 September, the fate of Delhi hung in the balance. Meanwhile, the chief of the police persuaded the king to take command. As per him, it was the last resort to stand against the British as one. Moreover, dire fighting was much better than a shameful death. Zafar had to make up his mind one way or another, but still he hesitated. His prime minister, Hakim, played on his fear and made him more hesitant to take the command, fearing of becoming a British prisoner. The king's decision to bless the uprising on 11th May was a crucial turning point that transformed a mutiny into a large rebellion. But his catastrophic failure of nerve after 4 months was a decisive moment that marked the beginning of the end of the rebellion. Meanwhile, the British were also on the point of collapse, as the morale and spirit of the troops continued to disintegrate. But the rebels could not get any advantage out of it, as their confidence had been fatally eroded by the king's frightened retreat. Early morning of 17th September, the King Zafar quietly slipped out of the Redfort without telling his Prime Minister or even his beloved wife, Zeenat Mahal. He was alone, but with a party of attendants, and brought with him his ancestral treasures. He made his way to the great Sufi shrine of Nizamuddin. The king then handed over his ancestral relics to their safekeeping. After a simple breakfast, Zafar burst into tears in front of the head Sufi. He knew that the lamp of the Mughal domination was fast burning out and will remain only for a few hours more. Later, he left for his summer palace, but after he had gone some way, Mirza Ilahe Baksh, father-in-law of his son Mirza Fakhru, rode up and said that there were robbers on the direction he was going. What he said was right, but the king never knew his cousin was in the pay of British Captain Hudson, and he had promised his paymaster that he would prevent the king from leaving the city. Hudson also made a deal with Zeenat Mahal and her father. Zeenat Mahal had promised the captain to pursue the king to surrender in return for the guarantee of her life and that of 3 men, including her son, father, and her husband, Zafar. The King Zafar ordered his palanquin to move towards Nizamuddin, where he waited for Zeenat Mahal to join him. Later, they together made for the mausoleum of Zafar's ancestors, the tomb of Humayun, the second Mughal emperor. Later, the king sent message to his prime minister to join him. The news that the king had abandoned the fort went like wildfire. By mid-morning, a great stream of people abandoned the city, taking their chances, heading out of the British-occupied gates. Many men and teenagers were shot dead in that attempt. The women and children were allowed though, after offering bribe to the British. Later that afternoon, Bakht Khan's troops had finally abandoned their forward positions in Kishanganj, and after that, for the British, the ridge and the camp were no longer under threat. The western half of the city continued to defy the British, and in the eastern half, British troops were able to make a steady progress. The very next day, rebels in great numbers evacuated the city by the south side. The Bareilly and Nimeg brigades left hurriedly in the direction of Gwalior. On September 20th, the British advanced to the Redfort. Virtually there was no resistance, as the palace defenders were already fled. The British blew up the gate. The Redfort was completely deserted already. Almost all the members of the imperial family had left the palace in search of safe places. In search of loot, the doors were forced open by the British. The private rooms of the Mughal emperor, storerooms, pantries, baths, all were ransacked by the barbarians. The palace furniture, men and women's clothing, dancing girls' frippery, vessels of food and drink, rich hangings, trappings, books and manuscripts, all had been tumbled and retumbled and tossed over and over again by the excited soldiery. That evening, the British soldiers danced jigs inside Juma Masjid, and Sikhs lit victory fires next to the mosque's holy mihrab. Later, a telegram was sent by one of the British officers to Lahore, proudly announcing that the struggle had entered in Delhi. The widespread rebellion of mutinous Bengal army had received a complete defeat in Upper India. The struggle had entered for the British, but for many inhabitants of Delhi, the worst trials were about to begin. The British regiments were ordered to clear the houses between Delhi and Turkmen Gate. The orders were also to shoot every soul. The worst of the slaughter was in Kacha Chalan, where around 1,400 Delhi Wallahs were cut down. Many pro-British loyalists at the court, confident of good treatment by the British, were also murdered by the British. The spies who had been supporting the English were continued to work as informers, helping the British to loot and kill and to find people to hang, for which they received 2 rupees for each name. On the night of 20th September, General Bakht Khan had stopped at Humayun's tomb and tried to persuade the king to accompany him to Lucknow, where he intended to continue to resist the British. But the king's prime minister convinced the king to stay in Delhi. He tried to convince the king that the British would not harm him and he would not be regarded as guilty. That night, Zafar's cousin, Mirza Ilahe Baksh, informed the British captain Hudson where the king and his wife were sheltering. In the morning of 21st September, Delhi was once more a dependency of the British Crown. The Captain Hudson sent Mirza Ilahi Bakhsh to the Humayun's tomb with a small escort of Punjabi regular cavalry. The king left the tomb along with his wife and her son and father, escorted by Mirza Ilahi Bakhsh. The king was taken to Redfort, no longer as an emperor, but as a prisoner. The next day, a second expedition was sent to the tomb. The objective was to capture three Mughal princes, Mirza Mughal, Kisra Sultan, and Abu Bakr. All had commanded the Mughal forces during the uprising. They were threatened to surrender unconditionally, and they had no choice. Captain Hudson told his men to hurry the princes along the road. After around 3 miles, a large and threatening crowd closed in and looked like they were going to rescue the princes. Stopping the cart, Hudson ordered the 3 princes to get out and strip naked. Then he took his Colt revolver and shot them dead in cold blood at point-blank range, one after another. When the death of the princes was announced to the king, he was shocked and was not able to react. But his wife, Zeenat Mahal, was thrilled, seeing that her son had a chance of succeeding to the throne. Throughout the city, gallows were erected for the mass execution by the British. A large crowd of the British officers had gathered to watch the entertainment provided by the execution. The executioners were bribed by the crowd to keep the victims in a long time dying and to enjoy their last-minute struggle. Not all the prisoners were hanged, some were shot to death. Many were captured by the British. The fate of anyone who had been associated with the court was worse. Most of the king's sons and grandsons were met with the same fate soon or later. As per the record, 29 sons of the royal house were taken and put to death. Only 2 sons of Zafar was known to have succeeded in making their escape. Many princes who were not guilty of any crime other than that of belonging to the Mughal dynasty were also not spared. Some were hanged and some were deported to Andaman and some were imprisoned in Agra, Allahabad and Kanpur. Many of them died within a few years owing to the harsh conditions of the imprisonment. By the end of January 1858, when all the noblemen of his Darbar had been tried and hanged, it was the turn of Zafar himself to face the trial. When the king was surrendered himself, he was given a guarantee that his life would be spared. Major Harriet, who had successfully prosecuted and hanged most of Zafar's court and family, was the man to prosecute the last Mughal emperor also. In response to various charges, the king offered only a single short-written defense in Urdu, denying any connections with the uprising. He stated that he had been a helpless prisoner of Sepoys. The judge Harriet believed that Zafar was an evil genius and the linchpin behind an international Muslim conspiracy stretching from Constantinople, Mecca, and Iran into the walls of Redfort. He declared that Zafar's intent was to subvert the British Empire and put Mughal in place. The trial dragged on for 2 months. Often it had to be adjourned owing to Zafar's ill health. There were occasions the emperor was carried groaning from the court. The court sat for the last time on 9th March at 11 a.m. in front of a crowded courtroom. The judge Harriet made his closing speech. For 2.5 hours, he again elaborated his theory of the uprising being an international Islamic conspiracy. In the concluding passage, he denied the idea that the uprising could be in any way connected with the activity of Christian missionaries. The king was declared guilty and he was sentenced to be transported for the remainder of his days either to one of the Andaman Islands or to other places selected by the Governor-General in council. Then followed a 7-month delay while the letters went back and forth between Delhi, Calcutta, Rangoon, Andaman, and even the Cape of Good Hope. The British tried to find a suitable place to exile the last Mughal. End of September, it was decided that the king had to be sent away from Delhi, even though his final destination had to be decided. At 4 a.m. on 7th October 1858, 332 years after Babur first conquered the city, the last Mughal emperor left Delhi in a bullock cart. Along with him went his wives, his two remaining children, concubines, and servants, a party of 31 in all, escorted by the British. The journey had been kept a secret even from the Zafar himself. No one crowded to see him going. It was completely still and quiet at that early hour. He had never in his life travelled farther than a day or two from his capital. His passage into exile was the longest journey he had ever taken. While the party reached Allahabad, the British decided their place of exile as Rangoon in the present-day Myanmar. Zafar was finally taken to Calcutta on 4th December. Zafar's party were quickly transferred into the ship HMS Magara. The ship left its moorings, and the last Mughal emperor steamed away from his homeland, never to return. After around 5 days, they arrived at the port of Rangoon. Back in Delhi, a program of mass destruction and colonial remodeling was beginning to remove many of the most familiar and beautiful landmarks of former Mughal capital that Zafar had left behind. It seemed like the whole city was being demolished. Some of the biggest and most famous bazaars, which were practically big as a small town, had gone without any trace. One cannot even tell where they were. Householders and shopkeepers could not point out where their houses and shops used to stand. Food was dear and death was cheap. The Prime Minister of United Kingdoms, the Lord Palmerston, wrote that Delhi should be deleted from the map, and every civil building connected with Mohammedan tradition should be leveled to the ground without regard to antiquarian venerations or artistic predilections. A general amnesty for anyone who had not personally murdered British civilians eventually became an official policy and was proclaimed in Queen Victoria's name on 1st November 1858. At the same time, in the Act 4, the Better Government of India, the British Crown finally assumed all the governmental responsibilities held by the East India Company, and its 24,000-man military force had to be incorporated into the British Army. Back in Rangoon, Zafar sat silently watching the passing shipping from his balcony. He was allowed no pen and paper, but he wrote verses on the walls of his prison with a bone stick. He was very weak and feeble. In the late October 1862, at the end of the monsoon, Zafar's condition became suddenly much worse. He was unable to swallow or keep down his food. After a long night's struggle, Zafar finally breathed his last at 5 a.m. on the morning of Friday, 7th November 1862. Immediately, the machinery of the empire swung into action to make sure that the passing of the last Mughal would be as discreet and uneventful as possible. He was buried on the same day, 4 p.m., in a brick grave. The British made sure that the witnesses were very few for the sad and historic moment. Zafar's death had marked the end of the great ruling dynasty, 350 years old. No newspaper, British or Indian, carried the news of Zafar's death in any detail. After all, it was 5 years since he had been banished from the city and sent into Burmese exile. In 1991, on 16th February, workmen digging a drain at the back of a shrine in Rangoon uncovered a brick-lined grave. It was 3 feet under the ground and about 25 feet from the shrine. The skeleton of the last Mughal was found quite intact within. In some ways, it is true that his life can be seen as a study in failure. He presided over the great collapse of Indo-Islamic civilization, and his contribution to the uprising of 1857 was hardly heroic. He is blamed by some nationalist historians for corresponding with the British during the fighting, and by others for failing to lead the rebels to victory. Yet it is difficult to see what more Zafar could have done, at least at the age of 82. Being a Mughal emperor, his fate is unthinkable. May God bless his soul. Thank you so much for watching this video. We'll see you soon in another video. Bye-bye.